Um, Status is an organizing principle in a number of different ways. It uh, accords rights for some people to direct a conversation, to assign tasks, to engage in evaluation of those activities by others. Um, it often reflects a degree of honor or esteem that is accorded to individuals and so on. What happens if you take that out?
So I may even choose to do this as a little podcasty thing and throw this out on that chart that I did. So just to recap for folks who are jumping on, you and I have been talking about my project, which is for my DMin, thinking about how we organize social systems in a trivalent curvilinear progression of trust. And that's a tease for another conversation that we'll post. But looking at how trust is organized vertically and laterally in social groups, and then how it progresses over time. And that's the three valences. But then also, it's never consistent in any one straight vector. So it's always curving, which was your fascination back in the day when you were trying to get a National Science Foundation grant.
Mm-hmm.
Your project, dear Dr. Shelley, is looking at how quantum mechanics influences social groups, particularly how groups organize and disorganize. And the literature that you've been able to dig up has basically been focused on how those groups organize and disorganize, which supports your thesis and your data idea. But the research tends to focus on how status is the main orientation for social grouping and interaction.
Mm-hmm.
So if A and B, say you and I are having a conversation, and the person who's listening decides they want to write something in the comments, they're going to align based on their presumption and assumption of how we are status, how you and I are organized by status.
Mm-hmm.
And you can extrapolate that out,
Yeah, yeah.
right? So what you're thinking about now is as you say yes and to that research
Mm-hmm.
and commit heresy in the social sciences, by the way, we just asked the question, what happens if you remove status as a factor in organizing principle? Or at least you cease to look for it, or you look for it as a part of a constellation of factors.
Okay, a couple of things to think about. One of them is it could be simply a focus not on hierarchy, but a focus on association. Who
So
is
what's the
talking?
difference between hierarchy and association? That's what I'm curious now about.
Hierarchy is that one of us talks more than the other. One of us has ideas that are more readily adopted by other people in the environment. Um, that the person who has fewer ideas or who has ideas less often adopted has lesser status than the person who has more.
And those are formal and informal. So, for
Yeah.
instance, you have canonical status as a professor emeritus of sociology at a university.
Mhm.
That's a canonical status.
Yes.
Your non-canonical status is you are a continuing social scientist and a researcher and philosopher of social organization.
And bring things into relationships with other people that
Right.
they quite necessarily understand because I'm talking a different language or
Now,
I'm
from
maybe differently.
Right. For me, canonically, I am a priest of the Episcopal Church, and I'm in a vertical relationship with my congregation and my bishop and the wider
Mhm.
relationships of the organization of the church and the denomination itself. I'm also informally related to the people I care for in the wider community of my town that I serve in, and
Yeah.
also as a dean of a convocation, which is an informal organization because it is not canonically sanctioned by the entire denomination.
Yeah.
And I'm also talking right now to you about this stuff. Armchair sociologist and
Yeah.
anthropologist.
Now, one of the things that we can talk about is the idea that the social network is what then becomes important. Once we take status out of this, who's talking to whom, or who has a relationship with who?
But is that an issue of the number of clicks I get, or is there something else entailed in that?
It could be the number of clicks as a recognition of that association. It could also, which would then turn around and be a measure of status.
Right. Which is why people have been focused on status for so long.
Yeah.
How do I fit in relationship to another person? You know, how do I orient horizontally and vertically in relationship to other people?
Yeah. And I'm trying to think of things. What happens when you take status out? One of them is that you can focus on who's talking to whom.
Right.
Simply treat individuals in these kinds of situations as parts of social networks, and the individuals are the nodes in the network.
But at the same time, you can't release that because these principles are all ultimately interrelated because no one of us is in a strictly binary or
Yeah.
triune whatever. There's no restrictive set of relationships because the minute you depart from this conversation, you'll be involved in others, as will I. And then
Yeah.
suddenly now those organizing principles of what's governing this interaction become not so much mute, but affect by extension those other
Yeah.
interactions that are not observed in this not observing or observable in this moment, but will then be determined about how we reacted in this conversation.
Yes. Okay. So one of them is that another possibility is uh, that we could have a situation where people are negotiating rewards with one another.
Right.
We each have a stack of chips, poker chips, and we're just trying to decide how to allocate those to various people. So, for instance, one of us can make an offer and say, "Well, gee, I'll give you 5 chips," and you have alternative people in the group who are offering you more chips, maybe 10. And the question then becomes, how do you arrange those trades with one another?
Mm-hmm.
And they don't necessarily have to fall in terms of status. They can be thought of as someone's better at negotiating than the other person.
But still, you're dealing with incentivization and you're still talking about a basic utilitarian argument.
Yeah,
How do we get out of the 19th century with that?
I don't have an answer to that because I've not really thought very much about this.
Well,
This is
you
very,
are, though. That's the point of this quantum social theory that you're
yeah,
working
yeah. So actually, what my big hope is that I will excite some student who's looking for a dissertation topic to consider this particular issue. How do I identify cusps? How long does that last? One of the interesting things about this little problem is if you get something that's stuck right in here.
Well, see, you're doing a visual and we're in audio right now if people are listening to this. So what
Oh,
we're
okay.
describing is as we talk about quantum theory and social engagement, we're talking about transitions through states. So think about
Yes.
water itself. Water can be water in 4 states, just for an
Mhm.
argument's sake. It can be ice when it's cold, it can be fluid when it's warm. When it's heated, it excites and becomes steam. And the steam itself, when it's taken to another state, becomes plasma.
Mhm.
And that doesn't even get into the fact that you can split its constituent molecular parts and turn it into atoms of hydrogen and oxygen, which is even more fun. And if you want to get into sedimentary deposits and other elements that water might possess, that's another thing. But as we move through the states of water, going back to your earth science class in middle
Yeah.
school, what do you encounter as you move from one state to the other? A transitional cusp, right?
Yes, a cusp.
And in
It
cusps,
was liquid and then became solid.
right? But in that cusp, the water itself effectively exists in 2 states at once,
Yes.
and but yet it's neither fully.
Hmm.
Hence quantum.
Yeah.
And you're saying that social groups actually transition through these cusps as well,
Yes.
from organized to disorganized states.
Yes. And disorganized states transition into organized states.
So your focus is twofold. The first is you're trying to identify how and what these states are.
Mm-hmm.
So you can identify and hold up to peers, this is what an organized state looks like, this is what a disorganized state looks like.
Yes.
But then the other thing you're trying to do is identify the nature and the nature, function, and dynamics of cusps.
Mm-hmm.
How do we know we're in a transitional state?
Yep.
So what does that mean for a social group if you had to pick and define that?
Ooh. I think it means several different things. As a group approaches this cusp situation, um, there are fundamentally some observables that can be put in place. One of them is that there are well ordered, and by that I mean that there is a set of norms that seem to govern interaction, that the group members uh, appear to agree to. For instance, um, talking. There is a pattern where an individual can offer an idea and have a response to that, and the response can be uh, I was going to use the word thoughtful, but I don't like that particular connotation. Um, the response can be a positive or a negative. That's one possibility.
And for those of
Uh,
you who are listening to this, remember my father's a mathematical social psychologist, so he's actually defining a value of 1 or 0. It's that
yes,
binary or positive or negative or however you want to imagine it, right?
yeah, mhm,
Plus or minus, on or off,
yeah.
etc.
So the basic notion here is that pattern, as you approach the cusp of, or the group becomes well organized, means that there's a set of norms that are operating in terms of who gets to talk, a turn-taking notion that we will in fact take turns in our conversation, um, that there are recognized positive and negative responses. Um, some of them can be verbal, some of them can be nonverbal. Um, so that's a possibility.
But as you say that, the thing that comes to mind to me is you're still talking about a resultant process. In other words, a process where something happens at the end that you can see.
Yeah.
And what you're identifying is that's well and good, and you can do that. However, if you're going to continue to see this as a dynamic, progressive interaction, as the group continues to exist in space and time,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to continue to do stuff.
Yeah.
And rather than thinking so you've got the plus or minus, and
Yes.
again, multiply that by the number of people who are interacting, by the number of interactions, by the number of choices that people are making, et cetera, et cetera. And now you're going to put that on a continuum of time or space as the people walk down the hall, and configurations in space change as people progress through time.
Mm-hmm.
You're still looking at a possibility of being able to understand that there is not so much a gestalt conclusive end, but rather a continual dynamic means of interaction.
Mm-hmm.
So you're talking about actually observing in real time and reflecting social interactions with resultant impacts
Mm-hmm.
that then become observable dynamics in and of themselves. And if you're able to gather enough data and do the quantum mathematics and all that, you can actually forge an algorithm that will then say, this is what it might look like 5 years from now.
Okay.
Do you think? I mean, that's
I think
ultimately what you're
that's
talking about.
plausible. That's plausible. Yeah, how one of the things we've learned from some various studies out there in status situations, in situations where status is active as as what's organizing the activity in a group, is that it persists through time.
Right.
Now, what I'm not sure about is how long that time is. Um, we've probably got some sense of that, um, that at least for groups that are in continual connection with one another, that status hierarchy probably persists over long periods of time, as in maybe years. Uh, for groups that are less likely to be in contact with one another, maybe the status order doesn't persist as well. There is some research that suggests that in short-term situations, that is periods of time of less than a year, some of that inequality that's initially identified will persist. Now, usually there is some attenuation. That is, that people don't as easily fall into, gee, I'm going to talk to Joe because Joe has a lot of good ideas, and I'll ignore Fred because Fred is a jerk. My definition of some bad ideas is what Fred has.
Poor Fred.
Poor Fred, yeah. But those kinds of things, it persists over time.
So I have a thought, because again, you're talking about micro to macro as well, right?
Yes, uh-huh.
And I'll land the plane with this. So, we'll leave people with a tease about what we're doing so they can get more. So, tune in to the post ASA presentation from Dr. Shelley on his paper on quantum organizing principles and social interactions. And, look for my unpublished, obscure dissertation down the line for my Doctor of Ministry program if I ever get it written.
You
Here's my
will.
thought as you talk about this, because ultimately, though you may always have to confer status integration into this, it still can, yes, persist over time. For instance, you being the big Civil War hero that you are,
Hmm.
the fact is that when it came to the codification of chattel slavery in the United States and the Western Hemisphere, even after it had been outlawed as a transcontinental, transoceanic slave trade, and even after it had been fought over and slaves had been emancipated as a result of the Civil War, though they attempted to organize social principles to reintegrate to a healed society, Reconstruction ultimately failed with the installation of what would eventually become Jim Crow,
Hmm.
and profound segregation in the South and the North and the West. And then on top of that, the challenge of returning soldiers from Europe and all the other factors that went into the civil rights movement taking place, which led to the mass incarceration of African Americans on the whole, and has resulted in the Black Lives Matter and other movements in the contemporary scene, plus reparations and all that. You see an arc of organizing and disorganizing principles with regard to one particular set of social interactions that, if we get better at understanding this, we can actually ameliorate some of the negative impacts in society.
Hmm. I'll buy that.
Well, there you go. So just so you can hear that, folks, is like, I know it sounds kind of pale to say, oh, yeah, there you go. You've just done hard science that proves what we knew all along. But the point is that you're taking something that's driven by the core epigenetic trauma that some people have experienced and other people's have benefited from, and you're turning it into a data that we can then look at and begin to work with so that we can affect change and observe how effective we are at really affecting that change over time because we've failed so much in the past.
Yep.
Does that concur? Do you concur, Dr. Shelley?
Yeah, I'll go along with that.
You sound speciously.
No, I think you're right. I think you're right. I think it's a good encapsulation of what we're trying to accomplish.
All right, folks,
I'm
more to
trying to
come.
accomplish.
We'll talk to you soon. Hold on.